When you're talking about the whole area of being and becoming, we are always involved in what I call the dialectic of life. The dialectic meaning the two modes, the two poles of being and doing. You are who you are, not because of what you do, but the fact of the matter is you do what you do because of who you are. And sometimes the doing helps you become at the same time. Let me give you a simple example on that. Very often we say when it is hard to pray, that is the time for you to pray the hardest. What do we mean by that? What we're really saying is, look, don't wait for the feeling to come on before you pray, but discipline your life, and the more you discipline it, that feeling converges in your life. You do the same thing in romance and love with your partners. You don't always have to feel like pulling the chair for them or opening the door for them. You just do it, and in the process of that doing, you are also becoming, and it affects your being. And I think Jesus does this very often. He tells us to use our will. Seek first the kingdom of the Lord and his righteousness. You shall search for me and find me when you shall search for me with all your heart. If any man will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. As a man thinketh in his heart, so he is. Out of the heart are the issues of life. So you see, he brings in both of these facets, that by will you express your choices, but the heart is really the seat and the fountain of those choices that we make. So what I would like to do in these sessions is start off with the area of being, because ultimately a leader can only do if he is. And I am assuming that he is placed in a position of leadership, or she is placed in a position of leadership, because certain qualities of life have already been perceived, or potentials are seen there, which are going to be garnered and stimulated and provoked. So I would like to introduce you to two main thoughts as we begin. I was reading yesterday a comment by Eisenhower. Eisenhower, as you know, described the White House as the loneliest house in the world. But Eisenhower was talking about leadership, in which he said, ultimately, really, it is you trying to get your mandate done in your timetable, in your desires, and in your way, while the one who is doing it for you is doing so because he feels he wants to do it. And what you're really doing is motivating, inspiring, and leading somebody, but getting him to also express himself and herself in the process. So you're not violating the individual. You're in no way leading somebody contrary to what they want to do, but at the same time building them. Now, it might interest you to know, and this is very important, that as far as I know, I meant to double check it yesterday, forgot it, but in the Greek there, the word leader is only used 4 times in the New Testament, out of which 1 or 2 of them are negative usages, the blind leaders of the blind. But the word servant is used over 1,000 times, which I think is very interesting, and by an abundance of usage, I know we have hammered the servanthood concept to the ground, but it is significant that there is so much that is told to us in serving, and so little encapsulating the image that is conjured up sometimes and the connotations of the word leader. But let us think of it as a servant leader concept, one who is both directive while at the same time humble and not manipulative, moving really in the concepts of biblical mandate. And one other final introductory thought is given to me by Richard Ellsworth Day, who in his book Filled with the Spirit says this: it would be no surprise if a study of secret causes were undertaken to find that every golden era in human history proceeds from the devotion and righteous passion of some single individual. This does not set aside the sovereignty of God. It simply indicates the instruments through which he uniformly works. There are no bona fide mass movements. It just looks that way. At the center of the column, there is always one man or woman who knows where his God is and where he is going. Very interesting. There are no bona fide mass movements. It only looks that way. At the center of the column is a man or a woman who knows his God, knows her God, and knows where God is going. Now, this is not in any way to minimize the abstraction of mass movements. We do not need to minimize the individuals who are involved in the support structure. But the longer I am in the ministry, the more I begin to see that somewhere at the heart of what is happening is the deep commitment and devotion of one single individual. And whether you look at Methodism, whether you look at Presbyterianism, whether you look at the CNMA, whether you look at the Nazarenes, somewhere somebody was at the center of that column with a vision much larger than himself or herself and just seeking to go where God wanted them to go. And I'm sure all of them, if they were to stand today and look back at what has developed by their commitment, would be the first ones to say, we never dreamed that this is what would emerge from that kind of a devotion and passion. One has to wonder whether A.B. Simpson ever thought that one day it would be one of the largest missionary organizations in the world, particularly in countries of such need, such as Cambodia, Vietnam, and so on. So when you and I are viewed as leaders, either by appointment or perception or by delegation, the fact of the matter is we are at the center of these movements. And there is no abstract movement that is moving ahead. There are individuals who are moving ahead, and therefore the cause of Christ is going on. It is for that reason I choose this subject as probably the most important that I could give to you, even if I were an expert in any other fields. As much as I love apologetics and love homiletics, preaching subjects and all of that, I don't think there is anything more important in your life and mine as Christian leaders than the leader and worship, because this will stress more of the being and then emerge into the doing. The first thing that I want to say to you is that the concept and the subject of worship is extremely important in your life and in mine. And I will give you many, many reasons for this. Number one, there is the biblical injunction. In John chapter 4, when the woman at the well was talking to Jesus, it is interesting that we often see it as a passage of evangelism, and it is. Jesus going through Samaria, a rabbi talking to a woman of questionable repute and communicating with her. But the key to that whole passage is when Jesus says, "The hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship him." And he uses a very, very important word on worship here. We will deal with that later on. But Jesus' challenge to the woman is that this is the hour for which I am here now. You have asked me, is it right to worship on this mountain or is it right to worship on that mountain? I say to you that the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. So Jesus calls for worship. Remember when Satan challenges Jesus on the temptation mount, what does Jesus say? "Begone, it is written, thou shalt worship the Lord your God with all your soul and all your heart and all your mind," and so on. So as we look at John 4, in the concept of the woman at the well, and we look at the temptation episode in the New Testament, you see the challenge of worship really coming through from Jesus. Psalm 29 and verse 2 is probably the classic verse. "Give unto the Lord the glory due unto his name. Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness." And he goes on to describe the desire for God that he has for us to worship him. Give unto the Lord the glory that is due unto his name. And I think he captures that in worship is really giving God that which is his due. It is not anything that he is requiring that is outlandish or in disproportion. That is precisely what is his due. As a matter of fact, the word worship, although I do not like this Anglo-Saxon contraction, and later on I will tell you why, comes from a contraction of worship. That's where the word worship really comes from. God is the one who is worthy of this. When you talk, for example, or look at the old prayer manual in the Anglican prayer book, you would see the man at some point in his marital vows using the word where he says to the bride, "With my body I you worship." That is a very good use of the Anglo-Saxon word worship. And what the bridegroom is really saying to the bride at that point is, in the way I commit my body to you, it'll be a distinctive commitment, for you alone are worthy of that relationship. There is no one else with whom I can relate in the way I relate to you. And I like the use of that word. And so in context, when you are bowing down before God, you're really saying, you alone are worthy of this degree of submission and reverence and praise and so on. But God challenges us through the word to demand that worship of us. And there are many, many other passages. If you look at the book of Revelation, they are cluttered with this idea that in heaven, worship will be our eternal occupation. And frankly, if we don't understand it, it is quite a boring concept. You take somebody who doesn't know what it is to worship and is barely able to endure Sunday morning 11 to 12, and say, I got good news for you. In heaven, this is what you're going to be occupied with all your life. That's about the worst news you could give them. Because for many of them, they have not yet come to recognize what it is. For to most of them, worship is something watched rather than done. It is a spectator idea where the performers come one by one onto the platform on the basis of which they are graded by the congregation. And at the end of the Sunday morning, the question of worship depends highly upon the merit and the performance level of those who delivered, while the others in the stands were watching and were witnesses to. So there is a biblical injunction, and on that basis alone we can go on. But I would like to go into the psychological and the philosophical and draw on this. I've talked about the existential predicament. What do I mean by that? If you wanted to write one word equivalent for the word existential, maybe let me give you two words for it. I would call it the passion of existence. The passion of existence. In other words, whenever a philosopher uses the word existential, he is at least meaning your existence. All right? He is at least meaning your existence. But in the classical term, what it really means is there is an awful lot of feeling and passion in this existence of mine. And if I can digress a little bit so that you can build a philosophical base on this as we go along. The fundamental difference between the Christian and the humanist or the existentialist is right here. The Christian, because of who he is, determines what he must do. The Christian, because of who he is, determines what he must do. I am a creature created in the image of God. Therefore, I shall not lie. I am a creature created in the image of God. Therefore, I shall not have an overly inflated opinion of myself as being a mini creator myself. I am a created dependent individual. Essence determines existence is the way I would put it for the Christian. Who I am essentially determines how I exist practically. If you were to go to the atheistic existentialist, and the reason I'm using atheistic before that is because sometimes you might hear someone saying Soren Kierkegaard was the first Christian existentialist. And if that is possible, what you're really hearing them say is Kierkegaard's Christianity was highly experience-oriented. That's all they're saying. He kept talking about his feelings in the Christian faith rather than coming up with doctrines. So if you ever asked a fellow like Kierkegaard to write out a doctrinal statement, he'll say, look, that is completely immaterial. I don't need to know anything about the eternal lostness of man. I don't need to know anything about the second coming. I don't need to know anything about the nature of God and this. All I want to tell you is that in my heart I feel a need, and that need is met as I serve God. That's all that matters to me. So, but I only explained that, but basically atheistic existentialism would say, what I do determines who I am. So if a man says, look, I find myself running around and being unfaithful to my wife, and you turn around and say there's something wrong with it, I say to you, what do you mean that's something wrong with it? I'm doing it, aren't I? We're all doing it, aren't we? And you see, this is where they're coming from. What I do determines who I am. It's what I call a salvation by survey syndrome. You find out what everybody's doing, and on the basis of that, decide what everybody ought to be doing. It's the Masters and Johnson. What's average is normal, what's normal is average, and what everybody is doing is good, and just leave it at that. Now, there is this thing though. In my experience, what do I feel? I am a creature of feeling. I don't get up in the morning detached from my sensations and my desires. And may I suggest to you that one of the things we all feel, and sometimes the women are more honest in admitting it than us men, and young people are more honest in showing it than us adults, is what I call the feeling of loneliness. We all feel it. People sometimes think, they would look at someone like me as a traveler. You're always traveling, you're always around people, you're always being asked questions, you're always in a mass setting and so on. They think there is a tremendous sense of with-itness because you are with so many people. And yet, you get back to your hotel room at night and you are very lonely. There is something on the inside of you that the hundreds of people could not meet. The thousands of people could not meet. As a matter of fact, Elvis Presley, when he was asked to describe his life in one word, he said alone. This feeling of loneliness is man's existential dilemma, which basically tells me he is driving outside of himself for some kind of fulfillment. And my thesis is going to be how worship ultimately answers these needs that no other relationship can answer. And when I talk to young people constantly, that concept of loneliness and peer pressure is a tremendous force that they face, that desire to be accepted, that desire for meaningful relationships and all. Thirdly is what I call mystical reality. Mystical reality. I am coming to you from countries like Malaysia, which is Islamic, Thailand, which is Buddhist, India, which is Hindu. Where did the mystical nature of man come from? Why is he building altars? Why is he erecting temples? Why is he putting dots on his forehead? Why is he shaving his head? Why does he go through ridiculous motions during his marriage ceremonies and funereal ceremonies? Mystical reality forces you and me to analyze what worship is all about. Why Christian worship and not Islamic worship? Why Christian worship and not Buddhist worship? Why is it that even people who are avowedly atheist will use the name of God at some of the most significant moments of political speeches? But you see, this mystical experience, sometimes in the laying of a wreath, other times in the burning of bodies or whatever it is, tells me I have to analyze what worship is all about. Fourth is what I call natural propensity. Natural propensity. There is, I think, this tremendous drive within myself towards the whole arena of finding meaningful relationships. There is a natural propensity within me of finding meaningful relationships. And as we look at some of those meaningful relationships, we find that there is a clue that relationship brings some kind of satisfaction. For example, for those of us who are parents, we need really no greater illustration than the fact that if you had to hug your car or hug your child, which is the one you spend more of your time doing? Although you may invest a lot of money in your car, and although you value your car because money is congealed life, and you have expressed that expression in the purchase of a good home or a good car, but when you see your house burning, your first concern is for someone whom you are related to in there. And the tragic moments of life are nowhere near as tragic as when relationships are severed, either by sin or by death. So that natural propensity and a relational clue, I think this is very, very significant. And this is where I believe the Christian faith has it over all the other systems of the world. Buddha never talks about having a personal relationship with him or with God. You will never hear of Allah as a personal God being related to you. Hinduism never ever talks of a loving God in Hinduism. Christianity is the only unique faith. As a matter of fact, when my second lecture at the Ramkhamhaeng University in Thailand, I said, if you were to give me some problems in your life that makes you confused, it was called Man's Search for Meaning. I said there are at least three. You are confused between eternity and finality. All right? There's eternity in your heart, but there's finality in your experience. And they agree with that. I say you're confused between the personal and the impersonal. You are a personal individual with personal needs, but the whole world sort of treats you in an impersonal way. So if you have an accident on the middle of the highway, the last thing in their mind is whether you are hurt or not. They want to make sure that you've got a good insurance policy to take care of the bumper that has been smashed. And how do you struggle with personal and impersonal? I said, so you struggle with the eternal and the final, you struggle with the personal and the impersonal, and then you struggle between freedom and enslavement. The more you seek freedom, the more enslaved you become to yourself. I said, so it seems to me the answer to life is somebody who can deal with this. So what I'm giving to you is an eternal God with a personal relationship who gives you the strength to be truly free. There is, I think, this tremendous drive within myself towards the whole arena of finding meaningful relationships. There is a natural propensity within me of finding meaningful relationships. And as we look at some of those meaningful relationships, we find that there is a clue that relationship brings some kind of satisfaction. For example, for those of us who are parents, we need really no greater illustration than the fact that if you had to hug your car or hug your child, which is the one you spend more of your time doing, although you may invest a lot of money in your car, and although you value your car because money is congealed life, and you have expressed that expression in the purchase of a good home or a good car. But when you see your house burning, your first concern is for someone whom you are related to in there. And the tragic moments of life are nowhere near as tragic as when relationships are severed, either by sin or by death. So there is that relational clue which I think drives me. What does the songwriter say? Heaven above is softer blue, earth around is sweeter green, something lives in every hue, Christless eyes have never seen. There's the clue to me. It is because of how I'm related to Him that the skies look bluer, the grass looks greener, and on the base of that dimension, this horizontal experience takes on more meaning. So that natural propensity and a relational clue, I think this is very, very significant. And this is where I believe the Christian faith has it over all the other systems of the world. Buddha never talks about having a personal relationship with him or with God. You will never hear of Allah as a personal God being related to you. Hinduism never ever talks of a loving God in Hinduism. Christianity is the only unique faith. As a matter of fact, when my second lecture at the Ramkhamhaeng University in Thailand, I said, if you were to give me some problems in your life that makes you confused, it was called Man's Search for Meaning. I said there are at least three. You are confused between eternity and finality. All right? There's eternity in your heart, but there's finality in your experience. And they agree with that. I say you're confused between the personal and the impersonal. You are a personal individual with personal needs, but the whole world sort of treats you in an impersonal way. So if you have an accident on the middle of the highway, the last thing in their mind is whether you are hurt or not. They want to make sure that you've got a good insurance policy to take care of the bumper that has been smashed. And how do you struggle with personal and impersonal? I said, so you struggle with the eternal and the final, you struggle with the personal and the impersonal, and then you struggle between freedom and enslavement. The more you seek freedom, the more enslaved you become to yourself. I said, so it seems to me the answer to life is somebody who can deal with this. So what I'm giving to you is an eternal God with a personal relationship who gives you the strength to be truly free. To do what you ought to do, rather than just what certain people tell you. Giving you the strength to do what you ought to do. And amazing in that Buddhist setting, that those who have no concept of a personal relationship with God come forward because they've never heard of such categories. So there's a natural propensity and a relational clue that you find relationships are where you find your meaning. And lastly, it's what I call personal sensitivity. This to me, I believe, is just as significant, because no matter how much we relate to the masses, ultimately we have to live with ourselves. Alfred North Whitehead has said, religion is what you do in your solitariness. If you have never been solitary, you have never been religious. And what he's really saying to me is your true religion is what you do when you are alone. So my first major point is worship is important. The Bible tells us that. Existentially we experience this. Mystical reality challenges us, natural propensity and personal sensitivity, etc. Having said that, let me now define my terms. I'll give you one simple definition and one complex one. It is the sense and the service of God. If I give you just those two words, I think you will find that to be sufficient, except that it needs an awful lot of theological input. But you cannot serve him unless you sense him in your life. It'll be a mockery. All right? You cannot serve him unless you sense him. And if you just sense him without serving him, you're not worshiping him. If you serve him without sensing him, it'll be a drudgery. You follow what I'm saying? These two are indispensable. Worship does incorporate the feeling of man, but at the same time, there is a volitional aspect to it too. And as we develop this, frankly, I think you will find this absolutely fascinating. Certainly I do. The deeper and deeper we get into the biblical mandate, and that's why I'm looking at it as a funnel, sort of looking at it philosophically, experientially and all, and narrowing it down to one thesis. Unless we can worship him individually, we will not be able to worship him corporately. And if we are not worshiping individually, how do we worship corporately? How do we really lead our congregation in the Christian faith? See, that's the backdrop from which I'm coming here. Now, this is the simple definition. Please let me give you a more elaborate one. And I know you will find it elaborate, but once we chew on that and sustain that, I'm going to sustain this biblically, but for now just make a note of it, because I think it'll begin to see. Can you back up with me for just a moment? Man is by nature multisensory, or multisensory. Now, I'm backing up for a moment in that relational and natural propensity. So please hear me very carefully, because this something significant I missed there. What would you think if you went to play a game of tennis and you came back one day and your wife said after you came back, how come you feel the need to play tennis? Don't I meet all your needs? What would you say? Suppose she really meant it, or you went out jogging or something like that, and you say, boy, that feels good, And she says, I thought you did that for muscle build-up. And you say, no, I don't do it for muscle. It really gives me a great feeling. Don't I meet your jogging needs? Is the sensation you get from playing a game of tennis the same as the sensation you get from loving your children? And the answer to that is no. Is the sensation you get from putting a delicious piece of pie into your mouth the same as the sensation you get from lifting weights? They are two completely different sensations, and both of them may be completely satisfying. What I say is this: by nature, you and I are multi-sensory creatures. There are different sensations within us that no one individual or activity can meet. You eat for a certain reason, and it's not only to stay healthy. You go and play a game for a certain reason, and it's not only for cardiovascular strength. You go to work for a certain reason, and it's not always only for money. There are a lot of people who will even work after their retiral years are there or whatever with no monetary remuneration because of a certain degree of satisfaction that comes in the productivity of manual labor or using their mind or whatever it is. You are a multi-sensory individual. And this is very pivotal because I think you will see that the only experience in life that satisfies all your senses is the experience of worship. It's a good thing I remembered that, for here is the definition. Worship is the submission. We go on forward now into the definition. Worship is the submission of all of our nature to God. It's the quickening of conscience by His holiness, nourishment of mind by His truth, purifying of imagination by His beauty, opening of the heart to His love, submission of will to His purpose. All this gathered up in adoration is the greatest of human expressions. All this gathered up in adoration is the greatest of human expressions. When one of the young people at Delat asked me about rock music, I said rock musicians very often remind me of a group of people who are sitting on a desert island and they are lost, and suddenly they see a bottle floating towards them and they grab it to find the message, only to realize it was a message from themselves that they'd put on the water the previous day. You see, man needs a message from outside of himself, because when he goes to himself, he is stymied in holiness, he is stymied in truth, he is stymied in beauty, he is stymied in love, he is stymied in purpose. And worship is where that's why I call man semi-transcendent. He is able to rise outside of himself, but he cannot stop at that. He has to go beyond himself and lift his countenance towards God. Now, when you talk about worship as in spirit and in truth, spirit providing the inward energy and feeling, truth providing the outward conformity and boundaries, all right? Spirit, the inner feeling and energy, truth, the outward boundaries. In other words, I don't only worship in spirit, I've also got to worship in truth. I don't only worship in truth, I've also got to worship in spirit. The inner man conformed by God's mandates, which basically then incorporates in here, if it is the greatest of expressions of which we are capable, it's dealing with my spirit. But how does it find the truth? My conscience is quickened by His holiness, not mine. My mind is nourished by His truth, not mine. My imagination is purified by His beauty, and the heart is open to His love, and the will is submitted to His purpose. These two definitions, I think, capture for me what worship is all about. And that's why I believe when you look at music and the imagination, when you look at preaching and His truth, when you turn to the Word of God and reflect on God for the conscience, and when you look at the invitation and submit your will, all of this is really a worshipful experience. That's why, as an evangelist, I frankly believe that the most powerful evangel in this world has been missed by the church, because the most powerful evangel is a congregation in worship. A worshiping congregation is a powerful evangel to a group of people. That's why the Lord's Supper, I think, is such a marvelous expression, for I do not know of any other activity in the church that takes into consideration man's multisensory nature. In that one symbolic expression, you take, you touch, you taste, you think back, you look forward, you love, you hope, you forgive, you are forgiven. And wrapped up in that expression, I think, is that marvelous multisensory expression before God. But these are the two definitions that I would like to leave with you before we move into the vocabulary of worship in the Word of God. All right, let's look at these words. The vocabulary of worship, basically what I'm meaning by that is the words for worship used in the New Testament. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with what the Septuagint is all about, or if not, the Septuagint was the Greek translation of the Old Testament, translated by the 70, and that's where the word sept comes from, the 70 that translated it. And so when you're taking Hebrew words and translating it into the Greek, which means you're using Greek terminologies but trying to capture Hebrew concepts, and the New Testament, of course, in the Greek. The first is the word proskunine. That's a Greek word. I've transliterated it, and I purposely transliterated it because you can see where an English word comes from in this, and that's the word prostrate. And the actual word means to kiss. And it comes from the concept of bowing down before somebody you revere and kissing the ground before them. Bowing down before somebody you revere and kissing the ground before them. You notice several examples of this. For example, when Jairus comes before Jesus and bows down, the word that is used there is the word proskunine. He prostrated himself and kissed the ground before Jesus. In Exodus 18:7, when Moses bows down before his father-in-law, the word is proskunine. In Esther 3:2, where Mordecai refuses to bow down before Haman, he says, I will not proskunine before you. What he's really saying is, I'm not going to bow down and kiss the ground before you, because that is a term of reverence. When you see in Matthew 8:2, the leper who prostrates himself before Jesus. In Mark 15:19, remember the Roman soldiers mockingly proskunining before Jesus. So the word is the word for prostrate, and it comes basically within the Gospels, meaning to kiss the ground. This is a very common form of reverence in the East even today. You go to many Hindu homes and you will notice people having to bow down, and they will generally kiss the feet of the father in the home, and this is the concept of reverencing, and it has quite a transcendent implication. I was talking to a Thai convert, a Chinese, who came forward at the meeting where I was preaching, and she said, now what am I going to do about the worship of my ancestors? Very significant problem. One fellow who came to the Lord on a Sunday morning is going into the Buddhist priesthood next year, and he's the oldest son. And he sat and talked with Norm Ford, the missionary. He said, do you know what will happen in my home if I now don't go into the priesthood? He said, by virtue of being the firstborn, I'm the only one who can mediate for my family. So I said, the only way to help them is in stages. And the first stage is, I would say to them, to ask their parents, where did Buddha tell you to bow down before your ancestors or to worship your ancestors? Paul Tillich said, religion is the essence of culture, and culture is the dress of religion. Religion is the essence of culture, and culture is the dress of religion. The essence of Indian culture is Hinduism, and the way they behave is the dress of Hinduism. So when they put the dot on their forehead, are they capitulating to a religious essence or to a cultural dress? You see, when they bow down and kiss, I think these are very significant. The hard part that individuals face, I know a Sikh convert from India who's now in Toronto, who is thoroughly converted, but he's just afraid to take his turban off, wondering what that'll do to his family. These are very strenuous questions that come their way. I think where one can detach it from worship, one must. Where one can keep it as respect, then if you talk to two missiologists, one will say ancestor worship is really not worship, it's just respect. If you talk to another missiologist, he'll say, oh no, it's worship. See, the cultural baggage that these things brings is so overwhelming. And also the cultural baggage we take into Christianity. Apart from that, the hail fellow well met, our culture is so free out here. We find it so easy to criticize the president or senators or leaders that we find it very easy to be freewheeling with God in our worship service. So every culture, I think, brings that. So the Easterner cannot come in without self-immolation, and the Westerner finds it harder to come with a tremendous sense of humility. I hope we can get into some of this as we go into cultural factors conditioning our consciousness, but I don't know if we'll get the time. This word proskunine, I'm going to make a thesis here, and I'll just like to bounce it off you. After Jesus physically left this world, you do not see this word occurring, except in Acts 10, where Cornelius, the Gentile, bows down before Peter. And what does Peter say in 10:25? He said, no. He said, I am only a man. Do not proskunine before me. And then in Revelation 19 and 10, where you see John sees himself bowing down before the angel. And the angel says, no, don't do this. Proskunine God. I'm only a messenger like yourself, the angel says. Don't bow down before me. Worship God. There is one other interesting reference, and that is in 1 Corinthians 14, where Paul is talking about tongues and prophecy. And he says if a heathen comes in their midst and sees this, he'll want to fall prostrate. So the only references are either to heathens who are doing it, or to an individual who is doing it before an angel and is rebuked and said, no, don't fall down before me. I am a messenger like yourself. Proskunine before God. In other words, the physical prostration is almost exclusively mandated or used in physical presence. Let me tell you where I'm coming from in this. When you look at the human nature that we have, suppose, I don't know whether you will relate to this illustration as well as, say, an Indian would or a Thai would. Suppose watches existed in Jesus' day, and I said to you, this watch belonged to Jesus, and you were convinced it did, and there was complete authority for this. Or suppose I had with me the Shroud of Turin here this morning, and every one of you were convinced that that was the shroud. And after showing it to you, I pick it and shove it aside and kick it into the corner and continue lecturing. How would you respond to that? All of a sudden you have transferred the essential reverence from God to the essential sacredness of the garment. And that's a natural propensity. I'm not at all surprised, frankly. I am convinced that Jesus, I have no way of authorizing this, but I am convinced that Jesus came in a day and age where he could not have been photographed or videoed. Because any one of us would admit that even a videoed reproduction of Christ with the Sermon on the Mount would be 1,000 times more effective than any one of the sermons we could muster up. But I think as soon as you've got that image, and as soon as you've got personal attachment and belongingness, you've got reverence for an object. This word proskunine, I'm going to make a thesis here, and I'll just like to bounce it off you. After Jesus physically left this world, you do not see this word occurring, except in Acts 10, where Cornelius, the Gentile, bows down before Peter. And what does Peter say in 10:25? He said, no. He said, I am only a man. Do not proskunine before me. And then in Revelation 19 and 10, where you see John sees himself bowing down before the angel. And the angel says, no, don't do this. Proskunine God. I'm only a messenger like yourself, the angel says. Don't bow down before me. Worship God. There is one other interesting reference, and that is in 1 Corinthians 14, where Paul is talking about tongues and prophecy. And he says if a heathen comes in their midst and sees this, he'll want to fall prostrate. So the only references are either to heathens who are doing it, or to an individual who is doing it before an angel and is rebuked and said, no, don't fall down before me. I am a messenger like yourself, proskunine before God. In other words, the physical prostration is almost exclusively mandated or used in physical presence. Let me tell you where I'm coming from in this. When you look at the human nature that we have, suppose, I don't know whether you will relate to this illustration as well as, say, an Indian would or a Thai would. Suppose watches existed in Jesus' day, and I said to you, this watch belonged to Jesus, and you were convinced it did, and there was complete authority for this. Or suppose I had with me the Shroud of Turin here this morning, and every one of you were convinced that that was the shroud. And after showing it to you, I pick it and shove it aside and kick it into the corner and continue lecturing. How would you respond to that? All of a sudden you have transferred the essential reverence from God to the essential sacredness of the garment. And that's a natural propensity. I'm not at all surprised, frankly. I am convinced that Jesus, I have no way of authorizing this, but I'm convinced that Jesus came in a day and age where he could not have been photographed or videoed. Because any one of us would admit that even a videoed reproduction of Christ with the Sermon on the Mount would be 1,000 times more effective than any one of the sermons we could muster up. But I think as soon as you've got that image, and as soon as you've got personal attachment and belongingness, you've got reverence for an object. You look at Hezekiah with the serpent of brass. I feel badly that he burnt the thing up. Hey, Hezekiah, put it in a museum. Why did you have to burn it up? You could have just locked it up behind wooden doors and let nobody see it. But he told the people, he said, you know what you've done? This was the means to an end, and you made it an end in itself. And he burned it and called it Nehushtan, the thing of brass. So the conclusion in prostrating and proskunine, I'm saying, is that it went out of use, except in the case of heathen's response or where it was prohibited and contraindicated. The second word is latreia. Latreia. This word means service. And this is very interesting. When I was doing a series of lectures in the Middle East on service, Sami Dagger, the Lebanese, his face just lit up when I brought this word in. He said, I have always not felt comfortable with the fact that the English translation says of Joshua, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. He said in the Arabic, that's not what it says. He says, it says, as for me and my house, we will worship the Lord. But you see, the Arabic took the word proskunine idea into the translation culturally, while the Greeks went with the serve idea in Joshua 24:10, I think it is. As for me and my house, we will latreia, we will serve the Lord. The concept of servanthood, the concept of service, and so on comes in here. And I just think this, to me, is, I'm overwhelmed by this passage. But in Luke 4:8, when Satan says to Jesus, if you proskunine before me, I will give you all these kingdoms. And Jesus looks at him and says, begone, it is written, you shall only proskunine before the Lord your God, and him alone will you latreia. Jesus captures both of those words in there. Sense and service. You shall not bow down before anyone else except God the Father, he says, and him alone will you serve. So the concept of reverencing and service is very, very implicit there. And the only analogy I find in these two words is really the analogy of marriage. I think it is, or probably the analogy particularly of a mother and a child, but even there I think the former concept is missing. I think when you look at a husband and wife relationship, there is an immense sense of respect for each other. One has to respect in order to love. And that's why I think where respect is gone, love really teeters and struggles and totters for a long while. But when you sense your love for your mate and you serve that individual, analogically you're carrying over in a human dimension a context which is different, granted, but when that vertical dimension comes in, you bow down before him and you serve him. Now, I want to point out some very important things with this word service, because I think this is where the leadership idea comes in. The word latreia is used in Luke 2:37 of Anna, who served God with fastings and prayers. All right? It talks about her as one who worshiped God or served God in fasting and prayer. You have another occurrence of the word latreia, where Paul in Romans 1:9 says, "For God is my witness, whom I latreia with my spirit." God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit. And in 2 Corinthians 8:18, he describes the concept of the ministry as latreia. And then in Romans 12, he talks about your body being a living sacrifice, which is your reasonable service. Now please notice, prayer is service, ministry is service, sacrifice and purity is service. In other words, any time I preach a sermon, it is first an offering to God before it is a presentation to people. All right? Every sermon is first an offering to God before it's a presentation to people. So if there's anything of self-serving there, it has to be removed. Or it is not a service rendered unto God. Where there is a flaunting or a self-aggrandizement or impure motives or preaching for money or things like that, at that point, preaching and the ministry ceases to be the worship of God. But I think it is fascinating to me that a sermon that is preached is an expression of my worship to God. And when I pray, Pascal was once asked why he prayed. And Pascal was not that mature a Christian at that point, but he said in his own, he's the father of the modern computer, he said, to constantly remind me of the dignity of causality. And what he was really saying is, I'm dependent. And I can summarize it in one statement, looking at all of this. Worship is coextensive with life. So let me put it differently. The worship service on Sunday morning is the point to which all of my life converges and the fountain from which all of my life emerges. In other words, if my life is not consistent with that Sunday morning, then I am not worshiping, even if I'm at a worship service. And if that worship service is not giving me the multisensory meaning sufficient to challenge my life, then I have really not worshipped after I've gone out. In a sense, we really start to worship as we leave. An individual is not worshiping God because he is at a worship service. I guess that's what I'm saying. He comes to that worship service because he's a worshiper of God. That's why I think he does not cheat on his taxes for the same reason that he takes the Lord's Supper. By that I mean, he does not cheat because God is the one he serves. Not for any other reason, because the law is going to clobber him. And he takes the Lord's Supper because God is the one he is obedient to. And this is where I believe life brings about meaning. Everything in my life converges from the fact that I'm a worshiper of the living God. So if I'm a businessman, I'm honest because I'm a Christian. If I love my wife with a purity of heart, it is not because you're not tempted, but it is because you're committed, and you're committed to somebody greater than she is. So this is all I'm saying, that all of your life converges, and so the worship service really becomes an ingathering of people whose life is coextensive with what that service symbolizes. And they walk out of there affirming that which they have stated in the way they live. So that coextensiveness is, I think, a pivotal concept. All right, the two other words then are the words for liturgia, which is a hard word to translate really, and it doesn't occur that many times in the New Testament. But basically, the word liturgia is much more, has a cultic connotation. Let me just lift it into a ceremonial connotation, liturgia. It's where we get the English word liturgy from. When Zacharias was in the temple, the time had come for his liturgy. He was fulfilling the liturgy at his time. And the idea there more is, I think, ceremony and symbol. The symbolism of the Lord's Supper, the symbol of silence, the symbol of ceremony, many things that we do that do not transfer deity to objects, but certainly brings about actions that point beyond themselves. When you cross the Jordan, take stones and put it there, so that in the years to come you can remind your children what happened here. It is much better for you to be circumcised in the heart, says the Lord. If all you're doing is the circumcision of the flesh, it is not good enough. But the reason I give that to you is so that you will always remember who you are. There was that symbolism that carried through. And some of the most meaningful moments in life we have ceremonies for. Dedication of our children, marriage, burial, and we should not shy away from it, because I think sometimes we are fearful of the proskunine corruption, that we've abandoned the baby with the bathwater, as it were, and we have become non-ceremonial beings. You see, the biggest difference, I think, between Israel and us today in that aspect is that they always had those festivals. I like to put it in these words to my own self. It is to give them the right to be legitimately preoccupied with certain doctrines. Because Christianity has so many doctrines to it, but it gave them the right to be legitimately preoccupied with redemption, legitimately preoccupied with deliverance from Egypt, legitimately preoccupied with settling their accounts in the Feast of Jubilees, etc. But today, of course, we don't have many of those festivals. Possibly the only one we do is Christmas, and that has become a very hard thing now to sort of disentangle from the commercialized nature of it all. So the symbols and ceremonies have gone. My suggestion in this area, as a pragmatic one, I'm not sure it works in every instance, I like to highly recommend ceremonies that the family observe, or symbols that the family subscribe to, whether it be the Advent readings, whether it be a celebration feast. I've often thought that the prodigal son came back home not because somebody gave him a classic argument of Thomas Aquinas for the existence of his father. I really don't think so, but I think he must have come home because he remembered his father's house and all that was transacted at the tables. And I think children remember the memories of these things more than they remember the powerful arguments that any apologist may give them. Arguments only take away lies. It is experience that reinforces truth. So that one of the things, for example, we do in our home 1 week before Christmas is what we call the Mensef. We picked it up in Jordan, where whenever a special guest comes, they invite him and his family, and they take a huge aluminum tray, pile it up with rice and all kinds of other goodies, furrow it in the middle, pour a certain kind of a gravy into it. You do not eat with implements, you use your hands, and you stand around there, and it's a symbol of total immersion with the people, as it were, and your commitment and trust with each other. And our kids really love it. As I've often said, Margie puts it on a low table, and we sit around that table, And I've often said it's lowered the value of our carpet, but raised the value of our relationship. And the funny thing is, somehow in that ceremony, they are able to ask you questions which they were afraid to ask you at other times. My own feeling on the Lord's Supper, therefore, is a highly prejudiced one. I think our inability to use sanctified imagination has taken away from us that enormous privilege on a more regular basis. I was speaking to 400 Wesleyan pastors, and I remember one of them, I said, I don't know why we don't do it more often. And one of them said, don't you think because if we did it very often, it would lose its worship value? And I just said to him, I said, do you feel the same way about the offering? And now I was just teasing him, and he himself started to laugh. I know why we don't do it more often. I think it's a much more significant total expression and so on. But maybe that's why we don't do it more often, because it's such a demand upon your own life and imagination and study and so on. Anyway, I'm sorry I went ahead on that. Let's look at one last word, and that is homologia. Very interesting word. Homo meaning same, logia meaning word, same word. The best equivalent of that is the word amen. So when you're worshiping as a group, and a person finishes praying, and you say, amen, you're saying, I endorse that. That's my expression. It is from this word, by the way, in Nehemiah 9, that we get the word confession. When the wall was built, they all gathered together for that homologia, to say we confess together before God. We profess our faith and so on, and dedicate this building. And I guess the simplest thing I would say is, it is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to worship without unity. It is very difficult to worship without unity. When you look at the Christian concept of God in contradistinction to every other concept of God, right from the beginning there has always been one struggle with man: unity and diversity. How do we find unity and diversity? As a matter of fact, the very word university comes from unity, university. When Aristotle postulated that there were four essences, earth, air, water, fire, his students said, wait a minute, we asked for one, you've given us four. What is the one essence that unites these other four? What is the quintessence, fifth essence of life? So man has been looking for unity and diversity for years. You and I have something to unite us, and yet we are diverse in our ways. University tried to do it, and they did, when theology was called the queen of the sciences. But today in universities you don't get theology departments, you get religion departments, and there's a difference. Theology starts with God, religion with man. Today they don't graduate from university, they graduate from pluriversity. See, the philosopher despises the rest of them. The doctor graduates hating the lawyer. Lawyer graduates hating the theologian. They don't understand each other because there's no connecting unity in diversity. And I said to this Muslim, you have a God who is a monad, one center. I said, who was he talking to before he created man? Who was he loving before he created man? I said, what you've really ended up is with a finite God who needed man to love, who needed man to talk to. I said, but when you look at the Trinity, you've got unity and diversity and a community in the Trinity right from the beginning. Worship cannot be authentic unless it's Trinitarian. And one aspect of the Trinity is community. So that the homologia concept that's why it is so important. I think that differences be settled. For where there is disunity, it makes it very hard to worship. And it's so important in that disunity to find a unity amidst the diversity. By the way, unity does not mean the same as uniformity. We can have two completely different churches and yet be united with the other without having a uniform pattern of worship or whatever it is. All right, here we are now, having finished the vocabulary of worship. And as I said, let me just summarize it with one statement, that Everything is a language in worship, whether we say it or not. The kind of music is a language, the kind of decoration is a language, and the reason we like silence while somebody is speaking, because you cannot have noise and chaos and so on. You're communicating in a sense of quietness. One of the questions that's always raised is the question of culture. And I do think there's one important idea that we need to make in the light of what the words for worship means, is that if the culture is contrary to the precepts of worship, then culture has to change. I like to highly recommend ceremonies that the family observe, or symbols that the family subscribe to, whether it be the Advent readings, whether it be a celebration feast. I've often thought that the prodigal son came back home not because somebody gave him a classic argument of Thomas Aquinas for the existence of his father. I really don't think so, but I think he must have come home because he remembered his father's house and all that was transacted at the tables. And I think children remember the memories of these things more than they remember the powerful arguments that any apologist may give them. Arguments only take away lies. It is experience that reinforces truth. So that one of the things, for example, we do in our home 1 week before Christmas is what we call the mensef. We picked it up in Jordan, where whenever a special guest comes, they invite him and his family, and they take a huge aluminum tray, pile it up with rice and all kinds of other goodies, furrow it in the middle, pour a certain kind of a gravy into it. You do not eat with implements, you use your hands, and you stand around there, and it's a symbol of total immersion with the people, as it were, and your commitment and trust with each other. And our kids really love it. As I've often said, Margie puts it on a low table, and we sit around that table. And I've often said it's lowered the value of our carpet, but raised the value of our relationship. And the funny thing is, somehow in that ceremony, they are able to ask you questions which they were afraid to ask you at other times. Let's look at one last word, and that is homologia. Very interesting word. Homo meaning same, logia meaning word, same word. The best equivalent of that is the word amen. So when you're worshiping as a group, and a person finishes praying, and you say amen, you're saying, I endorse that. That's my expression. It is from this word, by the way, in Nehemiah 9, that we get the word confession. When the wall was built, they all gathered together for that homologia, to say we confess together before God, we profess our faith and so on, and dedicate this building. And I guess the simplest thing I would say is, it is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to worship without unity. It is very difficult to worship without unity. When you look at the Christian concept of God in contradistinction to every other concept of God. I had a 1-hour dialogue with a Muslim in Thailand, and he asked me about the Trinity, and I said, I was hoping you would ask me about it. I said, I'd like to spend about half an hour with you on your concept of God and the Christian concept of God. And basically I talked about this. Right from the beginning, there has always been one struggle with man: unity and diversity. How do we find unity and diversity? As a matter of fact, the very word university comes from unity, university. If you look at your American coins, you will see a pluribus unum. Out of the many, one. When Aristotle postulated that there were 4 essences, earth, air, water, fire, his students said, wait a minute, we asked for 1, you've given us 4. What is the one essence that unites these other 4? What is the quintessence, 5th essence of life? So man has been looking for unity and diversity for years. You and I have something to unite us, and yet we are diverse in our ways. University tried to do it, and they did, when theology was called the queen of the sciences. But today in universities you don't get theology departments, you get religion departments, and there's a difference. Theology starts with God, religion with man. Today they don't graduate from university, they graduate from pluriversity. See, philosopher despises the rest of them. The doctor graduates hating the lawyer. Lawyer graduates hating the theologian. They don't understand each other because there's no connecting unity in diversity. And I said to this Muslim, you have a God who is a monad, one center. I said, who was he talking to before he created man? Who was he loving before he created man? I said, what you've really ended up is with a finite God who needed man to love, who needed man to talk to. I said, but when you look at the Trinity, you've got unity and diversity and a community in the Trinity right from the beginning. Worship cannot be authentic unless it's Trinitarian. And one aspect of the Trinity is community. So that the homologia concept is, that's why it is so important. I think that differences be settled. For where there is disunity, it makes it very hard to worship. And it's so important in that disunity to find a unity amidst the diversity. By the way, unity does not mean the same as uniformity. We can have two completely different churches and yet be united with the other without having a uniform pattern of worship or whatever it is. All right, here we are now, having finished the vocabulary of worship. And as I said, let me just summarize it with one statement, that everything is a language in worship, whether we say it or not. The kind of music is a language, the kind of decoration is a language, and the reason we like silence while somebody is speaking, because you cannot have noise and chaos and so on. You're communicating in a sense of quietness. One of the questions that's always raised is the question of culture. And I do think there's one important idea that we need to make in the light of what the words for worship means, is that if the culture is contrary to the precepts of worship, then culture has to change. I don't know of how else to put that. For example, I remember speaking on worship in one of the Oriental countries, and while I was speaking, there was a dog on the platform. This was during church service. There was a dog moving in and out of the platform, and children were playing hopscotch in the back. This was a mud floor and so on. And I said to somebody in my lecture, I said, now, what do you think of that? And he put his hand up and he said, don't you think that's culture? I said, no. I said, why don't you allow dogs into your Buddhist temples then? You see, in Buddhist temples, you can't even sit with your feet facing Buddha. Your feet have to be in the other direction. I said, why is it the culture suddenly reverses within the Buddhist framework? I said, is it maybe that you have allowed culture to play a more dominant role in the evangelical faith, and in the rigors of Buddhism you have not been allowed to influence it? So my basic thesis is, if culture is contrary to the clear biblical precepts, then culture has to change. And sometimes it is inescapable. The principle I like is, when God says through the prophet Malachi, when you go into your governor's presence, try offering this and see if he will accept it from your hand. And what the principle that emerges is, when you're treating the highest in your society, how do you behave then? And all of a sudden you'll find out that there are no dogs running between legs while Rajiv Gandhi is speaking. You see, because they give that respect and so on. So let me tell you why I'm approaching it this way. And we'll get into more details as we go, but just as constant reminders, so that every time we go onto a jog, I always believe philosophy comes at three levels: theory, drama, and life. When you're dealing with Aristotle and Socrates and Plato, you're dealing with theory. You may never read it, but believe me, you use it in your life. When you're looking at television, you're watching a philosophy of life. Your children are imbibing a philosophy of life. And the reason existentialism was the fastest growing philosophy, it never gave them the theory, it just came to them through television. And then when you're sitting around the kitchen table and your son says, what's wrong with homosexuality? That's a philosophical question. And I've always said, argue at level 1, illustrate from level 2, apply at level 3. Argue level 1, illustrate level 2, apply at level 3. If you argue from level 3, you're in problems. But all I'm saying to you now is that, just in case you're wondering what this has to do with life, it has everything to do with life. We are going from theory to life. And when the practical applications come, you will see it is because theoretical underpinnings had to be made. And that's the philosophical direction in which you're moving. All right, section 4 is what I'm calling errors in forms and corruptions in substance. Errors in forms and corruptions of substance. And when you're dealing with errors in forms and corruptions of substance, you are dealing with two different areas. Now, let me define my terms. When I'm talking about a form, I'm talking about the structure and the framework. When I'm talking about substance, I'm talking about the foundation. Very important to know the distinction. A thing may be formatively inadequate. If it's formatively inadequate, it is a problem, but it is not a critical problem. It is an important problem. But when you're talking about that which is substantively in danger, then the whole building is in danger. So errors in forms are important, but they are not of as critical a nature as the corruptions of substance. And these are the modern day errors in forms that I think, I perceive, and the forms are defective. So the worship service is the form. The message that's coming through is the substance. All right, one the framework, the other the foundation. For example, if you've got 2x4s that are building a room, the 2x4s may not be aesthetically placed, in which case you've got a problem with taste. But if the 2x4s are eaten through with termites, then it's not a problem of aesthetics. See, then it's one of existence and survival. So let me go through what I consider some of the errors in forms today. One of the errors in forms that I see is what I call the style of a verbal monologue, where one individual can dominate and the others receive without participating. This is a formative problem as I perceive it. You see, when you are preaching, that is what is going on. But the worship service is so much more than the preaching. When you're preaching, it is in a sense a monologue, although I think it can become dialogical in settings where you can respond or interact or discuss it with others or whatever. But formatively speaking, it yields itself to far too much of monotony and sometimes control. I think a concept of participating and involvement, such as corporate prayer, such as music, I think one of the most either underestimated or overestimated departments of the church. One of my friends used to say, when Lucifer fell, he fell in the choir loft. And his whole problem was you will generally end up with more problems because music is an artistic expression. And artists are very sensitive people. And when they're expressing music, they're expressing their innermost soul. They're most vulnerable at it. And when you dismantle the person's most aesthetic expression, you are really destroying them in a sense. Just as I think preaching is the expression of your innermost soul. And it is not an easy thing to be critiqued on preaching because you are at your most vulnerable there. Now, I'm not saying it cannot and ought not to be done. I'm just saying very often when I go for meetings, somebody will be very kind and say, look, we've cut all the preliminaries down. We're just going to have 5 minutes of announcements, and then the word they'll use is turn you loose, you know. And I say, you're making a mistake. I say, you're making a mistake. I say, you get the musician who knows what he or she is doing. They can do more for preparing that audience for the sermon than I can do in a 15-minute introduction. They condition the heart and imagination in order to receive it. So here is a great expression that relieves us from the monologue. or the offering aspect as worship. And there are so many dimensions which I'd like to get into, hopefully in the practical aspect. But one corruption I see is the verbal monologue. Let me just read a couple of comments here. We won't have time to go into this. Important theological and psychological issues begin to arise here, such as the conception of worship as an expression of the priesthood of the people, as a celebrative action in which all participate, as the involvement of my total being. It makes us think of worship as something watched rather than something done. So there are important theological aspects here that need to come in. Secondly, worship formatively becomes an error where obsolete forms may be used only because they are old. Older is better. See, the Catholic Church hit this head on and just about crucified themselves in the process. The Latin language, it was the saintly language. And they started losing their young people right, left, and center. The young person says, I don't even understand what is going on. I remember being at the NBC studios once where they were giving a lecture on Johnny Carson, and they said, this is the star where he stands when he gives his monologue. And when they asked for questions, everybody said, can we stand on that star for a moment? And I stood there and I said, good grief, I could hardly wait for my turn to go and stand on the star. But I'll tell you, when I went through East Germany, I sure wanted to step into the pulpits where Martin Luther had stood. And one young person came to me after that service there and he said, I want to say something to you. He said, we've been doing this for 4 Sundays here. They've been having a different speaker. He said, and all I've been hearing for 4 weeks is what happened 50 years ago. And I said to him, look, I sympathize where you're coming from. I said, but don't ever forget that the only thing worse than nostalgia is amnesia. To have no memory at all is worse than going only to the past. And I said, and what they are doing is delivering you from your amnesia. I said, they are letting you know whence you came. So let's hold that in balance. Tradition does inform the church. After all, the Holy Spirit is not something brand new that has arrived in our generation. He has been speaking to generations gone by. But in communication, it is very important if we do not communicate idiomatically in a way that we can be understood. It is pointless. It's like looking at a person walking through the streets of India and he mutters something in English and the Indian shrugs his shoulders and says the only thing he knows in English, which is, I know speak English. And you know what the Englishman will do? He'll shout louder. He'll gesture harder and shout louder as if his volume is going to make up for the illiteracy of his listener. And sometimes we do end up shouting louder with older forms. So I think it's an error in form when an obsolete form is clung to only because it is old. I think if it is treasuring a truth that is corrupted by any other form, then we need to look at that. The third corruption in form is what I call where cultural influences are accepted as norm. And the question I ask, therefore, in this is just one question. Are all forms okay? Is form only a mold, and does it not matter at all what form we use? I think it is pivotal, particularly as we communicate to younger people and as we communicate cross-culturally. I'll tell you, we are such a prejudiced people internationally. It's sometimes I wonder how the United Nations even communicate with each other, and I guess they don't. I remember being at a banquet at the Waldorf there once with UN people, and we were told that the only way these people came was if most of them were preconditioned as to whom they would not sit with. So the Iranians would not sit with the Iraqis, the Pakistanis would not sit with the Indians, and these are the boys solving the world's problems. But it is very interesting. I'll tell you what I use psychologically when I'm overseas, and Margie chuckles at it all the time. It is so effective. When I say to them, when I'm trying to communicate something to them that I know is correct biblically and is practiced in the West, but they want to reject it because it is practiced in the West, then immediately I say, when I was in India, I was struggling with a certain issue or something, and it brings a whole new context to them. Oh yeah, this boy was struggling with it in India, you see. So it must be all right to struggle with it in Thailand. After all, they got their religion from India, so when Indians struggled with it, a Thai can struggle with it. And I had in my audience people sitting asking, how do Christians deal with this? There was one woman in our audience whom I went out for lunch with, and she looked at me and she said, what you're telling me is this, that if I become a Christian, I give up my job. I said, why do you say that? She said, as a teacher, I have to lead my children in Buddhist rites. And so you're telling me that I resign my job. I said, I am telling you this, that if God is who He claims to be, and He is speaking to you, your responsibility is to respond to Him. And if He has the power to save you, He can help you face your job and deal with the issues as they come one day at a time. And if it means abandoning your job, then He will give you the strength to deal with that. She said, I'm not ready yet. This was at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She said, when's your next sermon? I said, 3. She said, I've got to go to a wedding at about 5:30. I said, I'll be through by 4. She was there and she was the first one to respond. And afterwards she said, I've taken a first step and I have said to Jesus, if you really are who you claim to be, I'm willing to serve you. Just show yourself to me. Good enough, for a first step for a person coming from that kind of a Buddhist background. But my question is, are all forms all right? And we need to ask our young people that. At any point, does the form destroy the message? See, suppose I say to my wife, this is my way of loving you, whether you feel loved or not. I'm going to give you a Jim Reeves record for your birthday, whether you like Jim Reeves or not, because I do like him. At that point, has the form become sovereign over substance? And we need, particularly for our young generation, to keep harnessing this in their minds, that just because culturally I find this nice, does not mean all forms are all right. Sometimes they are vestiges of a different substance. Number 4, forms, I think, become spurious when they force us to pretend that things are not the way they really are. For example, for me to stand up and sing, and he walks with me and talks with me and tells me that I am his own, and the joy we share as we tarry there none other has ever known. To sing it while I don't even have a devotional life is a spurious. If our hymnology were our theology, I think we'd run into problems. Because experientially sometimes it just does not measure up. Now, please bear in mind, I'm not knocking it, I'm just saying a form becomes dangerous. Sometimes, for example, in rallies we are forced to say things and do things that may not be very real to our own experience. And we conjure up emotion in an effort to sustain essence. If you clap loud enough and hard enough and strong enough, you will become happy whether you're happy or not. You see, so we take the form and force it into an existence here. Now please listen to this argument very, very carefully. There is a sense in which Jesus is there to contradict us. In other words, if I come into a worship service and find it irrelevant, then I have to ask myself one question. Is it because God is irrelevant to me or I am irrelevant to God? What is the reason for this irrelevance? Is the irrelevance that my life is not measuring up? Or is the irrelevance the fact that somehow God doesn't seem to have a vital place in my life? See, Jesus Christ continually contradicts us in the way we experience ourselves as alive. And He compels us to radically redefine what we mean by life. He encounters us the way He encountered the disciples on Easter Sunday. They were the ones marked out for death. Those who had survived Him were really the dead. He, the dead one, was really the living. And so Jesus had to stop the disciples and say, look boys, don't weep for me. Women, don't weep for me, because I've never been more alive than I am now. But weep for yourselves and your children, because this generation is the dead generation. What do I mean by this? Suppose I were to come in feeling very badly that, I had a bad day at work yesterday or something, and that maybe would like to have seen better income. And I sit in the room there, the sanctuary there, and the pastor is preaching on the refugee problem of the world. And I say, wait a minute, I came here with enough problems, you're dumping one more on me. That's a good question. Maybe I am intended to be lifted beyond my own little world and look at a world that is much larger than mine. That is what I call the contradiction of Christ. Maybe I came to the church feeling very good. It's so nice to be in a nation where you're free to worship. And he's going to preach from the text that these were sawn asunder in this world and walked around in sheepskins, and so on. I say, I was just feeling so good about how nice it is to be here, and you have thrown this heavy on me. What is happening? At that moment, I think what is really happening is that I am being asked to make my life relevant to God's Word. The Word is already relevant. I'm the one who has to do the changing. This is the challenge of the leader in worship every Sunday morning, and that's why it's so hard. What he's taking is 400 different people, one who has come from a world of the stock index, the other one who's come from the fact where he's been turning a nut and bolt 3 turns every day for 8 hours. A third fellow has come from the fact that his son was picked up on drugs through the week. And a fourth fellow has come from the fact that his wife just told him this week she doesn't love him anymore. And a fifth fellow who comes there just having taken a course in Orthodox theology. How are you going to be relevant to all 5 of them? The relevance is already there. The challenge is for these people to become relevant to that. And that is the task, I think, of leading in worship. You see, this is so clear in the Old Testament. This is so clear in the Old Testament, where God actually takes over 10 chapters to dictate the design of the tabernacle. Now, don't tell me God didn't have more important things to do with Moses. All he could have said to Moses was, gather for a place for me to worship. But you see, today, for example, we do not send our church leaders to Sinai to get a description for our next building. And the reason we don't do that is because in those days they went to the sanctuary. These days we take the sanctuary with us. So when 400 people come to worship, they are really not coming to the sanctuary, but 400 sanctuaries are coming into a building to worship. Which means, if it was so important to God how the tabernacle was kept and what was in it, it is equally important to God how this temple is maintained and what is in it. For this is where I truly worship with Him now. And if somebody comes to me and says, I'm free to choose any way I want, this is where the charismatic movement, when it's taken to an extreme, commits suicide. As soon as individuality has a priority over community, you're going to run into problems. I think I may be free to choose to worship so long as I remain within the confines of truth in my private life, but in the corporate worship, there is a surrender involved. And I think the hardest difference for the evangelical is to have a distinction between the priesthood of the believer and not make it into the papacy of the believer. Because at that point, it becomes ex cathedra, inerrant. I cannot make any errors. When I speak, I'm infallible. A corruption of form comes about when one thinks he is free to choose. Number 2, when Christianity is reduced to a system of values. Reduced to a system of values, and worship just becomes an affirmation of those values. Why do I say that? Some years ago, the Dalai Lama came to New York. The Dalai Lama is from Tibet, worshipped as the incarnation of the Buddha. I don't think there was anything sadder than for him to step into one of our large churches in New York City, and thousands of clergymen gathered together to hear him deliver the address. Here is a man who's an atheist, who affirms himself to be the incarnation of Buddha. And Protestant Catholic ministers sitting there and walking away wowed by him. After all, we all believe in the same fundamentals of right and wrong. That's not the issue. That's why I don't like worship. I don't think God sits at the top of a hierarchy. He is. And every other God isn't. And Christianity is Jesus Christ coming not to make bad people good, but to make dead people live. And if we are not alive unto God, goodness is a secondary issue. And I will deal with this as we come to the Old Testament concept. For you see, in the Old Testament concept, first out of Egypt, redemption, then the law, morality or righteousness, then the tabernacle or worship. Redemption is always prior to righteousness. Unless one is redeemed, he can't be righteous. Redemption precedes righteousness, and redemption and righteousness precedes worship. If I'm unrighteous but redeemed, I really am not worshiping. He gave them the 10 Commandments after he brought them out of the land of Egypt. And then he gave them the tabernacle where they were to worship. And this is the sequence in which we follow. So Christianity is really not just an affirmation of values. It's an affirmation of a transcending world that has precedence over this world. One difference between Buddhism and Hindu worship, in distinction to ours, is theirs is an affirmation of their values. Christianity goes far beyond just an affirmation of the values. And that's why liberal worship today is not worship. The substance has been corrupted. So when you hear press reporters talking about the fundamental difference between the evangelicals and the moderates and the Southern Baptists is whether the Bible is literally true in everything that it affirms or just taken in spirit, the boys don't know what they're talking about. It's not as simplistic as that. It's like saying the difference between a liberal pilot and a moderate pilot is whether one believes the manual or the other doesn't. Well, does it matter whether you believe the manual or not? So to just take a statement like that and make us look like idiots is talking out in a vacuum without realizing that we are either looking for a truth outside of ourselves or within ourselves. And the substance of modern liberal worship is not worship at all, because the substance has been corrupted. And you can have the two same forms, with one having substance and the other having no substance. See, the difference between the evangelical and the liberal was when the God is Dead movement came about. The liberal said, dialogue, don't defend. So he ended up dialoguing with nothing left to defend. And the evangelical went about saying, proclaim, don't persuade. And he ended up proclaiming in a vacuum without persuading the people. So here's where we are dealing with the area of more than just values. Number 3, corruption of substance, that the purpose of worship is to produce happiness rather than holiness. That the purpose of worship is to produce happiness rather than holiness. I used to say to my students at Nyack that the thunder and lightning at Sinai for Moses was not so that he could enjoy the glow on the landscape. Moses could have come back saying that was a beautiful scenery. You ought to have seen it. But the rest of the Israelis down there were so terrified by this that's when they came out with that famous statement. And I've often wondered what would have happened if they hadn't done that, whether the whole future of Israel's history would have been different, when they said, look, after seeing what we've seen, we really cannot come into the presence of God that easily. Will you be our spokesman for us? And in a sense, they squandered their priesthood in that one request. I think that's a very fascinating verse. See, Moses wanted Aaron to do it. The people wanted Moses to do it. And before you knew, God was really looking for somebody who would dare to come to him and hear what he had to say and follow along. So the thunder and lightning at Sinai is not so that Moses could enjoy the glow on the landscape. Number 5, when one can unconsciously confuse an aesthetic experience with a worship experience. When one can confuse an aesthetic experience because it was something beautiful with a worshipful experience. Let me see if I can illustrate this. You can have a tremendously overwhelming feeling at the end of an evening without worshiping. And I think that is what I'm driving at. For example, it is possible to even generate a great feeling after an evening of entertainment. And so that was beautiful singing, beautiful voices, beautiful stage, beautiful everything, beautiful hall, beautiful all of this, without the experience of worship. That is a corruption of substance. So you can, you know who are the best ones at this? Are politicians at great ceremonial occasions. When they make tremendous speeches that everybody goes away feeling so good about it. And yet it has got very little to do with the activity of worship, aesthetics. And we have to watch this very carefully in the West because we have access to such aesthetics. You know, we can have a beautiful building, we can have a beautiful colors, we can have beautiful, you go into some of these places and they've got so little of everything that when they do walk out there, you've got to know that they're obviously not here for an aesthetic experience because there aren't any aesthetics. You have to bring your own with you type of thing. But the aesthetic experience. And lastly, to confuse being entertained. To confuse being entertained with worshiping. When you put these forms and substance together, I remember speaking at a campaign where the theme song every day was, "It's bubbling, it's bubbling, it's bubbling in my soul. It's singing, it's laughing since Jesus made me whole. Folks don't understand it, nor can I keep it quiet. It's bubbling, 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 bubbling day and night." And I was a young evangelist starting out there in Eastern Canada, and I remember the first picture that was conjured up in my mind was a Christian who was sound asleep but grinning from ear to ear, because it was bubbling, 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 bubbling day and night. That was exactly the image that came in my mind. Somebody sound asleep but laughing. You know, you take those corruptions of errors and forms, and if you were a non-believer and you came in here, you'd either think of Christianity as something that it is not, or you would think of your people as being hypocrites. You'd say, "Oh, look, the fellow who brought me here, I can tell you he's not bubbling day and night. And there are others I know too who are not bubbling day and night, and they are Christian people." This is the reason for it. We confuse being entertained with worshiping. And please don't get me wrong. If I see some little 5-year-old stand up and sing or whatever and make a few mistakes in the process, I can really have a great laugh and truly be entertained. And there is nothing wrong with being entertained. The point of difference here is not that this is wrong and this is right. It is only to say that this is not this. That is all. That is the only point we are making. So those are some of the areas that we deal with in errors and forms and corruptions of substance. My next subheading here is what I've called theological foundations for worship. Theology serves 3 functions. And by the way, theology, of course, the study of God. Sometimes I like to look at it as the theos, the logos, the Father, the Son, and if you can bring in the Spirit there. But theology is the study of God. It serves 3 functions. It is genitive, that is, it generates. It is critical, and it is conservative. If you ask somebody whether he is a Calvinist or an Arminian, sometimes 9 times out of 10, he goes to the Bible as a Calvinist or an Arminian, forces the scripture to fit his position. And so rather than generating his theology from his study, he forces his study to fit his theology. I'll give you a good example of this. When I was speaking in Thailand, we had the question of tongues. All right? And 1 hour, by the way, 1 hour to answer that question. And I opened the scriptures. I said, I guess that's a safe place to begin. And let's go to it. And I said to them, I want to ask you some questions. I said, Paul very often taught truth through asking questions. Is the law therefore evil? Hardly, I said, so an interrogative question is where the answer is obvious. He is only raising it in a question rather than a statement form. I said, so. He closes 1 Corinthians 12 with these series of questions, and I said, and I want you to answer all of them in what answer Paul was expecting. I said, here are his questions. Are all apostles? I said, what is the answer? No. Are all prophets? So what is the answer? No. Are all teachers? What is the answer he's expecting? No. Do all work miracles? No. Do all have gifts of healing? No. Do all speak in tongues? One of the girls says, I don't know. You see what she was doing? Theology wasn't generating her position. Her position was generating theology. Now, what I'm trying to say is, and it's very, very important to hear this, sound theology does not guarantee good worship, but it is indispensable to it. Sound theology does not guarantee good worship, but it is indispensable to it. Which means there is no substitute for studying and knowing God if one is to truly lead in worship. Now, Radhakrishnan, the Indian philosopher, said this, and I want you to listen very carefully. He said, the problem with Christians is that they are worried about right doctrine and not right conduct. Now, my question to Radhakrishnan is, wait a minute, how do you know what right conduct is until you know what right doctrine is? Systematic theology is necessary. If what you're saying is our problem is we worry about right doctrine and then don't worry about how we live, that's another problem. But if you're saying right doctrine is not important, you have no right to say that. Scriptures, hermeneutics, interpretation, biblical theology, inductive Bible study, systematic theology, and that's when you come into worship. Then you come into homiletics preaching. So the ultimate, thus saith the Lord, stands on an awful lot of levels. So when the evangelist stands up and says, the Bible says, he is preceding that by this. And so genitive goes back to this. Genitive, it generates good theology, generates worship. Secondly, critical. When you understand something theologically, you're able to critique properly. If you don't have good theology, it's like trying to discuss a measurement without an absolute. It can't be done. And lastly, conservative. If you've got good orthodox theology, it conserves worship. You will generally find that the theologians will die in a society first, and then its Bible colleges and its pastors. Where you have not got good teaching coming through and not good conservative theology, you will end up with an awful lot of heterodoxy. My Greek teacher in Bible school used to say the reason you guys are not good Greek students is because you're not good English students. He said, I can't teach you Greek until you've learned English, since that's the medium that I'm using with which to teach you Greek. And the reason many of us do not know what cults are is because we have forgotten what orthodox theology is. Follow me, the only way to know whether something is heresy is to know what is the orthodox position on it. And good theology generates, criticizes, and conserves. And I'm using the word criticizes not in the pejorative sense, but in the constructive sense. And this is where I think as leaders, we can help those who are going into error. You say, look, you had a service in which you had people do this and this and this and this. How do you feel that measures up with the New Testament concept of such and such? You're critiquing the pattern at that point on the basis of theology. All right, so those are the three roles of theology. Obviously, there are many more. So when you're dealing with the transcendent God, your worship is worshiping the transcendent one. The doctrine of transcendence. By that I mean all the reverence and the awe and the proskunine and the latreia and the liturgia and the homologia, all of this is going in, directed towards the transcendent one. And we need to remember that no matter how near he gets, he is still transcendent. Secondly is power. It's power. I've used a more modern word. The word is omnipotence, really. If I were to follow through with transcendence and omnipotence, I've often thought of modern day philosophers who lash out against God as like a little boy putting on a pair of sneakers and kicking a tank. What do you prove? What does this young philosophical mind prove? And that's why Pascal said, when all our arguments are over trying to disprove him, and we think we've got all the answers within ourselves, God is going to come down with his ring of keys and say, gentlemen, it's closing time. I think what he's really saying is, you cannot mess with omnipotence. You can talk as loudly as you want. That's why I like the concept, the Lord of hosts is the Lord of power. But I also like the fact that he didn't go through Rome in order to prove that to us. Because that's not the power we're really talking about. It is really the power of eternity and truth that is locked up in him. And truth, even if 1,000,000 people shout against it, do not disprove it. It is still true. The third is what I call everlasting, eternal. Before Abraham was, I am. You see, in a sense, God's second coming has already taken place in his mind. It's only you and I that are waiting for it. God is in the eternal now. And that's why when God makes that covenant to Abraham, remember what he did? Chop up the piece of the animal and walk through it? What that's really saying in that covenantal expression is, if I fail to do what I'm supposed to do, may that be done to me which is done to the animal, which means you got it, boy. For it is impossible for God not to be. The concept that emerges is one of transcendence, one of power, one of eternity, and the last is one of a providing God. This God is not so far removed and like the deistic concept taken away. But this God is always there to provide. The wonderful thing that he gave to Moses was that your fathers did not know me as Yahweh. And what he's really saying is, Moses, they saw me as transcendent. They never saw me as immanent. But I am going to be with you. The with you God is speaking to you. And that's why when Jacob gets up and he says, truly the presence of the Lord was here and I did not know it. And what he's really saying is, I missed the fact that God was with me right here, setting up that ladder, and is going to continue to keep those promises. And the thing that the Hebrews feared more than anything else was the concept expressed by David in Psalm 51, take not your Holy Spirit from me. And in Ezekiel 10, where the Holy God departed, that was the one day they dreaded. That's why they said, right, Ichabod, the glory has gone. The worst thing you could tell a Hebrew was Ichabod. And really, that can also be as a question mark, not the glory has gone. Where is the glory? I am with you, God. So the transcendent God who is powerful and loving is the with you God. So these are the concepts that emerge. And so the whole Israeli concept, when you look back, is really on the basis of the names of God. Jehovah El Olam, God everlasting. Jehovah El Shaddai, God Almighty. Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides. Jehovah Tsidkenu, the Lord our righteousness. See, the names captured their theology for them in all of this. What's in a name? An awful lot. And which will help me summarize the Old Testament worship and then summarize the 6 elements of New Testament worship. The 3 things in the Old Testament worship were the Exodus, the law, and the sacrifice. They were redeemed, they understood the righteousness, and they came to God in order to sacrifice. I don't know if you have ever seen a sacrifice. I have seen it once in my life, and I'm sure glad the system no longer applies. Not in its bloody form anyway. I've often wondered what would happen if God said, next time you tell a lie, bring me your car and burn it. I'll tell you, that'd be a very effective way of teaching me. Next time you have undue pride within yourself, bring me your bed and burn it. Pretty soon we'll have we'll be having nothing in our homes. That's why I said money is congealed life. You did this, go and buy a lamb and bring it here. Which means you got to pay. But the problem that became there was the rich could appease and the poor had no way. And he said, look, the blood of bulls and goats was only intended to point towards me. Ultimately, they could not have paid. And you've got to understand sacrifice on the cross. Have you ever thought of this? I wondered why Jesus didn't go and die in a corner alone and just send the message that he was dying. I think he made himself a public spectacle so that the horror of sin would be visible to us in concrete terms. I really believe that. It's like a drunkard whom you keep telling not to drink, not to drink, not to drink, and he doesn't listen until one day in his drunken stupor he drives home and does not see where he's going, and in his driveway runs over his own child. Then he sees what liquor has done more than any other argument can say to him. So when the Christ spectacle is on the cross, we see in concrete terms what we are doing when we lust, what we are doing when we are greedy, what we are doing when we are proud. So the body of Christ tells me you're only thinking of it in abstractions. When you lust, you're mangling the purpose for which I created your body. When you're materialistic, you're mangling the very essence of your being, and you will never be a happy person. When you're proud, you will find out that the worms are going to eat your body, and it is ultimately going into rottenness. Therefore, what shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world but loses his own soul? What shall a man give in exchange for his soul is the question. So when you're dealing with the sacrificial system and all of that, you're dealing with the heinousness of sin. But when you turn to the New Testament, which is my last thought on this, there are 6 elements that the New Testament worship had. You had the apostles' teaching. Acts 2:42-47 will give you the details on this. You have the apostles' teaching, you have praise, you have prayer, you have fellowship, you have giving, and you have the Lord's Supper. There is very little else that we have to go by when we look at the early church. From Acts 2:42-47, we look at the apostles' teaching, we look at praise, we look at prayer, we look at fellowship, we look at giving, we look at the Lord's Supper. Now, I feel that this is where all of these are addressed. It is the teaching that helps us to handle these expressions. You know, Martin Lloyd-Jones, he was rather extreme in everything he said, and so we have to take it in that sense. He tended to overstate his case, maybe to state it. For example, he had very little place for personal illustration in his sermons and so on. He described apologetics as the curse of the 20th century church. And he said that he had no place for counseling in his own ministry there. And his reason was, he said, if you are teaching systematically, you are counseling corporately. Now, I think that is overstated, but I think he is onto something there. A lot of our problems can be averted if the good teaching comes through, and sometimes the problem is not that people need to know, it's that they need to apply. And if counseling is doing anything, all it is just, helping give the shove, saying, you know what to do. And so one of the principles I often apply in counseling is turn the question around and say, if I came to you, I was talking to a fellow who wanted to leave his wife and children. And I said, I'd like you to pause for just a moment and reverse this whole thing. And you're sitting at the other side of the table, and I'm coming to you, and I'm telling you I want to leave my wife and children. What would you say to me? And they have the answers. They have the answers. And you turn around, and most often you find out that that's where it comes from. Now, the problem with teaching is that it is being forced in a visually oriented world to only auditorily create the pictures. That is the challenge today, and it's not an easy challenge. The only 2 effective ways of communication in the long run are propositionally and relationally. Propositionally and relationally. Because in the long run, the harnessing of that picture, actually pictures constrict. They are marvelous, but they constrict. There is only one way that picture will be there, and it has that superimposition of the artist's opinion upon your own. But the Word gives you the beauty of your own sovereignty and your own imagination. That's why I think the challenge of the preacher is not even so much the teaching, but it is the illustration. The windows that let the light in. And what I keep telling my students in their preaching ministry is that their biggest challenge is going to be to open the windows to let the light in. Which is what Spurgeon described the illustration as. He says, if the sermon is the building and the illustration of the windows, you can read a whole book to find one illustration and it'll be worth it. It'll be worth it because it turns on the light for somebody. And what you've taken is vast vistas of truth. And for children and young people particularly, the illustration is of ultimate importance. So the Apostles' teaching, orthodoxy, that is communicated meaningfully. This business of praise is maybe the one we could spend some time on. And this is where many of our people head into difficulty. How do I praise God? And I'll tell you, when you're dealing with different denominations or abominations, you really run into problems. Leighton Ford said Jesus, when he was in this world, healed one blind person with mud and another without mud. He said if that had happened in our day, we'd have two denominations, the Muddites and the anti-Muddites. Do you know how many denominations there are in this world today? There's a listing of 20,000. Now, there are thousands of them with just one member. And it's one-man denominations. But you go into these places, and in every place, you've got a different expression. Some people will clap non-stop from 10 to 12. And you can even be singing When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, and there's some kind of beat attached to it so that it almost becomes a hallelujah type of thing, where you can even rejoice in pain. Or in other cases where it is so perfect that the resurrection becomes a dirge. You've got such a variety of expressions. Some are what I call clappers, some are foot tappers, some are hip shakers. You've got all of these things sandwiched into this mess. What I believe are some of the parameters that are very, very important in this is for people to remember that worship is a spiritual exercise, not a physical one. Worship is a spiritual exercise, not a physical one. And you can worship God for a whole hour without having a circus as an expression. And sometimes these things do happen, that it is first a matter of the Spirit. And if you want, my suggestion to them is study the Scriptures in what it means to be a Spirit-filled person, and then discuss the spiritual expression. When you look at Colossians, when you look at Galatians, what are the sins of the flesh? That's where I think our battle is. And Satan has diverted it and made us argue and battle over these things, because that's where only the expression is, not the essence is. So worship is first a spiritual exercise before it is a physical exercise. The second thing is corporate worship gives priority to the corporateness, not to the individuality. Corporate worship gives expression to the corporateness, not to the individuality. And the reason I say that is because people just come in and one can express an awful lot of physical emotion, which is distracting for the reason you're there. The reason you're there is to get your eyes off people. But praise has become an end in itself. It is a means to an end. We are dealing with areas that are highly, highly sensitive and maybe ought to be given some biblical thought and some biblical expression. But truly, corporate worship, I think, is very, very different to individual worship. May I just mention one other thing, and that is in the area of fellowship. Fellowship, I think, is very important because it gives a person an opportunity to express themselves. We don't often think of that way, but it's like people want to get to you after a message because they've heard you, now they want you to hear them. That's why they're there. And I think it is very important in fellowship to build relationships. And in the concept of a church where you've got large numbers, and somebody says, look, it's very hard to have fellowship in large numbers. Of course it is. It is very hard to have a personal fellowship even in large families. But that's not a sufficient reason against a large family. People will always find a handful with whom they are close, and that's where they find their close friendships. And it is a responsibility, I think, of the church members and the leadership to help individuals who have not even found that small group with whom they are close and express their personal feelings. And then these different little groups can find the total commonality there. Now, when you look at all these concepts on worship, my challenge to you and to me as leaders is this: the only way I can begin to transmit some of those things in the church is if I have learned how to worship individually. Very, very important that I have an individual life of worship. And I'll tell you, as a traveling man in this last month, hitting time zones and missing so many nights of sleep, it is the one thing that I needed more, because I was giving. And yet it was the biggest problem every day. When you're preaching 3 or 4 times, I preached 51 times in the last 27 days, you really are expressing without being impressed. Of all the things, therefore, I leave with you as a leader, harness a pattern for your personal life of worship. It is more important for us to talk to God about people than it is to talk to people about God. So said Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I have a pattern developed by Robert Murray McShane, who died when he was 31 years old, from Dundee, Scotland. And Robert Murray McShane wrote out a pattern for devotions that were extraordinary. I have tried many. I like his the best. He spent years compiling it. He keeps you in the Psalms 60% of the year, which means your accounts are kept close with God. He takes you through the Old Testament once and the New Testament twice every year. And they're all related studies. I found it most beneficial, and I introduce that to my students. I find that to be, you see, one of the problems with not having a pattern is when you're missed, you never know where to get back. But if you've got a pattern, you know exactly where you got off. So learning to worship individually. Secondly, I think it is family worship. If you ask me what is the one thing I miss most in my travels, apart from the nice fact that you can make it romantic and so on and say, I miss my wife and my children, I do. But the time I miss most from each day is that time of family worship. I really miss it, because that's where our children are learning the discipline of worship. And if they can't worship in a family, they find it very hard to worship in church. And I'll be very honest with you, I'm not really saying to you this is easy. At the end of a long day, it's very hard to get excited. You want to sit on that lazy boy and go to sleep. You really do. Especially at about 8 p.m. when you've just had a full dinner and your whole worldview has changed. You're sitting on that chair, and to be actively involved in a young person's life. And I think the third, as we deal with this, is for the people in the church to form that group that you may call the committee or whatever it is, that really gives an opportunity for individuals to come into that setting and express their desires in worship. What is it that our group is not meeting for you? And it may be a completely wrong desire, but I think if you just have a static committee, you will have a static expression. I really believe in God's diversity and God's creativity. I think only God could create a preacher both as refined as Jonathan Edwards and as erratic as Billy Sunday, and bless both of them. There is that unity and diversity that shows through. But if it means helping our young people grow in the knowledge of the truth by helping them voice their opinion, you'd be amazed when you sit down with young people and say, what do you like best about church? What do you like hardest? And the truth of the matter is, the reason you're asking the question is not so that they can control what is going on, but they can have an opportunity to make good theological decisions. And this is where I think that committee needs a dynamic nature to it, not a static nature to it. The static nature needs to be theology, but the dynamic nature needs to be fresh input, so that you've got the synthesis and the antithesis, and you've got the thesis and the antithesis, and comes out with the synthesis. But I would start here. Until it starts here, it cannot go through that. So all I'm saying is, with the concepts of worship, and brethren, as I said, out of 32 hours of material, when you shrink it into about 2 or 3, you end up with, for example, the whole concept of praise. I have a lecture on this that deals with what I call the harmony of the soul. And that's where I give the philosophical argument. The soul needs to be harmonious, truth, beauty, and justice. And if the music is not bringing truth, beauty, and justice, then it's not bringing harmony. It's bringing discord, and so on and so forth. But that, to me, sums up what I would call the leader in worship.
Well, that concludes our series on Christian worship, and we're grateful that you've been with us today. To learn more, visit us anytime on the web at rzim.org. Our website has many things to offer. You can learn about Ravi, his history, and his ministry. You'll also find helpful essays and articles, as well as our newsletter, Just Thinking. And our online store is a great place to preview and order products. That website, once again, is rzim.org. The message you heard today is available in its entirety as part of our 2-CD album. When you contact us, ask for CD Album 209, The Leadership Workshop on Worship. Again, that's CD 209, The Leadership Workshop on Worship. The price is $11. Prices are slightly higher in Canada. If you'd like to order by phone, you can call us at 1-800-448-6766. The order line is available 24 hours a day. That's 1-800-448-6766. If you prefer to write, address your envelope to RZIM, Post Office Box 921939, Norcross, Georgia 30010. That's RZIM, Post Office Box 921939, Norcross, Georgia 30010. If you listen in Canada, that address is 50 Gervais Drive, Suite 315, Toronto, Ontario, M3C 1Z3. The Canadian address, once again, is 50 Gervais Drive, Suite 315, Toronto, Ontario, M3C 1Z3. Please be sure to give us the call letters of this station when you contact us. That helps us to better evaluate the effectiveness of the broadcast. This weekly program, Let My People Think, is a listener-supported radio ministry and a production of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, Atlanta, Georgia.